There's a lot of rubbish being said about Scott Morrison's attack on Labor over China. And I tell you what, when so many people are screaming, "You can't say that," I ask, what is it that they don't want you to hear? Now, in this case, it's the details of a very worrying speech given in China just 2.5 years ago by Labor's deputy leader, Richard Marles, that contains stuff that I think is even more worrying than what Morrison has said. Marles has scrubbed that speech from his website, but I have it. And I'm going to show you the troubling part so you can then decide for yourself. Is this really something we should politely ignore? Now, last night...
Well, can't make your job any easier when politicians do politicise it.
So I'll leave the politics to the politicians, but I'm very clear with everyone that I need to be that that's not helpful for us.
Now, last night I said that Morrison had gone too far in suggesting that Marles and his leader, Anthony Albanese, were almost traitors. China's Manchurian candidate, he called Marles. Morrison went too far and turned a serious debate into a sideshow punch-up, and he seemed even to get the rebuke you just heard from the head of ASIO last night on the ABC. Well, whether you think he was referring to Morrison or not, today a former ASIO boss, Stena Richardson, followed up with a string of interviews claiming that Morrison's attack did only help China by pretending that there was some difference between Labor and the Liberals and China when there was not.
I know why they're doing it.
Yeah.
But it is grubby beyond belief. I think the government would be delighted with the fact that everyone's now talking about national security. However, it's achieving that goal in a way that is damaging to the national interest.
Yeah, well, hang on. Let's not get too precious here, right? Let's not clutch the pearls. Now, I agree. I've said so myself on this show. There's virtually no difference between the two parties, Labor and the Liberals, on paper. The question is, will Labor, if it wins the election, in fact be as tough as it says before the election? And there, on that point, reading Richard Marles' speech in Beijing, I again wonder about exactly that. And tonight I'm going to do what I'm surprised no one else has done and tell you exactly what is in that speech that should worry us all. And it's not just the bit that caused headlines even at the time. Marles' astonishing suggestion in China that we somehow get closer military ties with it. Or as he put it, we respect China, deeply value our relationship. We must seek to build on it. And not just in economic terms, but also through exploring political cooperation, and even defense cooperation. I mean, defense cooperation with the Chinese military, with whom we could soon be at war. I mean, the whole idea is insane. But I'm afraid there's more. Now, first, let me give you the background to this speech. You go back 2 years. Marles is, as he is now, Labor's deputy leader and its defence spokesman. He leads a Labor delegation to China that included another Labor frontbencher, Tanya Plibersek. And they were wined and they were dined and they were given spin by Chinese officials, and so much of it. By the time that he gave his speech, Marles seemed keen to be very friendly. And there's one more thing to remember as I'm taking you through this. Richard Marles is actually from the Labor right. He's pro-American. But if even he could say these things, what is the Labor left saying? Okay. In the speech Richard Marles gave to the Beijing Foreign Studies University in 2019, to his credit, he told the students that Labor fully backed our alliance with the United States. It stood for freedom, it stood for human rights. He is no Manchurian candidate, in other words. The question is he weak? Is Labor weak? Let me quote more of this speech. Okay, yes, Marles did indeed mention human rights. We can all agree, he said, to take a more cooperative, positive approach to contentious issues, including human rights. But then, in China, he actually praised China on that very point. He said China freeing millions of Chinese families from hunger and poverty is also an unbelievable human rights achievement. But that is exactly the dictatorship's excuse. China claims that making people richer is the real human right. the excuse for China denying people its other rights, like a vote. And Marles' praise also ignores the communist regime's greatest crime, creating a man-made famine through its stupid communist policies during its insane Great Leap Forward that killed an estimated 40 million people. 40 million people, or perhaps even more. Okay, you know, Marles is in the Chinese capital. He wants to be polite, all right? But there is a pattern here. Take this bit of his speech. Marles began strong enough, once again, you know, when necessary, we're going to raise our concern about human rights as we have about the minority Uyghur population or the situation in Hong Kong. Marles can't even call the situation by his name. What he means is China crashing democracy in Hong Kong. But then he cringes. Of course. At the same time, he says, violence can never be condoned, even in the form of protest. But that is exactly, once again, exactly China's excuse for banning democracy protests in Hong Kong. Are they violent? And throwing pro-democracy politicians and journalists and activists in jail. They were being violent, it said, being seditious. So you see the pattern here. Fine words from Labor about standing up for our values, but already suggesting excuses for China. But finally, to the part that really worries me. Marles went on in this speech in China, the value of this relationship is just as significant now as it has ever been. Indeed, it is more so because of the presence today of the 1.2 million strong Chinese-Australian community who want positive relations between Australia and China. Sounds innocuous? Sure, we'd all like a healthier relationship with China. But Marles mentioning those 1.2 million Chinese Australians, so many voters, scares me. That's because we are now reading articles in The Australian, on SBS2, reporting warnings that some Chinese Australians think that the Morrison government's strong stance on China could backfire at the election because many marginal electorates contain large communities with Chinese heritage. And that is so true. I mean, 6 seats at the next election have more than 20% ethnic Chinese voters. Yet here we now read warnings. Government should go softer on the Chinese dictatorship to please them, win the seats. There's Raymond Lee, for instance, a member of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Victoria, saying China should be accorded respect as our biggest trade partner. He says, I won't be voting for Liberals and can also speak for good numbers of Chinese Australians who have never voted Labor prior, but in the coming election, they will be voting for Labor. And another example from another Chinese Australian organisation, there seems to be a very lopsided target on the Chinese government. What it misses, coalition's policies, is a lot of nuance, but also racial sensitivity. And on it went, these warnings. Asian Business Association of Whitehorse also warning Chinese Australian voters turning off the Morrison government because it said Chinese people are more proud than before. And this is the craziness of the identity politics that Labor loves. People seeming to put their racial identity, their racial pride, their loyalty or their nationalism for their old home above what I think are Australia's most fundamental values: freedom, democracy, free speech. Now, happily, I actually refuse to believe that most Australian Chinese think that way. Many are here precisely because they are fleeing from that communist oppression. The pro-Beijing people we're now hearing from, go softer on China, actually tend to be business people who need access to China's markets. Or maybe they're just scared what this vicious regime will do to them or their relatives in China if they don't back it here. But the problem is that Labor has a sick history of playing ethnic politics for gain. Just look how it's selling out pro-Israel voters to go instead for Muslim voters, because there's 7 times more Muslim voters than there are Jewish ones. Do you really trust Labor not to whisper to pro-Beijing voters in the Chinese community, business people with money, that it would be more sensitive to China. Donations, please. And that is why Richard Marles' speech so worries me. It's the weakness, the hints, it's all there. No wonder he scrubbed it from his website. Now, I know Richard Marles, like him personally, he may have changed his mind since then, but he should come out and say so, and say why. Labor just going around screaming, unfair, shut up, hush the debate, like so many ABC journalists. Don't even talk about all this. Is not enough. It's too important. And that is why Scott Morrison has some excuse to repeat again today what he said yesterday, even if I do think he goes too far.
If there's any country out there, including our region, who thinks they can bully and coerce Australia, Mr Speaker, they won't find a preferred candidate in this Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. They might find one on the other side, and they certainly seem to have picked one.